I moved to the small town of Millwood to start a job at one of the local major industries. It was a significant change in my life, leaving behind the hustle and bustle of the big city for a slower pace. The apartment I found was far from perfect, old, with a persistent musty smell and decor that seemed stuck in the 70s. But it was what I could afford. The first days were quiet. I was busy unpacking and settling in, barely paying attention to what was happening around me. But as the new routine set in, I began to notice small quirks. My next-door neighbor, a middle-aged man with deeply sunken eyes and a scruffy beard, always greeted me with a silent nod. He never spoke, just nodded. One night, as I tried to sleep, I began to hear noises coming from his apartment. At first, I thought it was the TV or some old appliance, but then I realized they were murmurs, low and almost inaudible, but definitely human. Sometimes, it sounded as if he was calling someone, or something. It must be nothing, I thought, trying to convince myself as the discomfort grew. The nighttime noises became more frequent, and one night, the volume of the murmurs increased considerably. Driven by a mix of frustration and curiosity, I decided to confront my neighbor. With my heart racing, I knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again, harder. The door, surprisingly unlocked, opened slowly with a creak that chilled my spine. I hesitated at the entrance. The darkness of the apartment seemed to swallow me. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing strangely in the empty space. There were no signs of furniture, just an old radio on the floor, broadcasting static. The air was heavy, as if saturated with a forgotten story. I returned to my apartment, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. As I entered, the shock paralyzed me. My things were tossed about, drawers open, books and papers scattered on the floor. I ran to check the windows and doors, but they were all locked as I had left them. In the days that followed, my mind found no peace. The murmurs continued, now mixed with heavy footsteps that seemed to drag along the building's corridor. One night, as I lay awake, trying to ignore the increasingly intense whispers, something changed. The sound seemed to be inside my own apartment. I froze, listening closely, until I realized the sound was coming from a dark corner of my bedroom. It wasn't my neighbor, but his voice was distorted, as if he were speaking through a slightly open door or a thin wall. The murmurs intensified, turning into incomprehensible and threatening words. I saw a shadow cast on the wall, moving erratically, as if someone was on the other side of a thin curtain. In a panic, I threw my pillow in the direction of the shadow, hoping to scare off whatever it was. But the pillow just hit the wall with a thud and fell to the floor. That night was the longest of my life. When dawn finally came, the sound stopped and there was no shadow. I think I might have started to imagine things. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my most important belongings and left the apartment before the sun set again. I don't know what lived next to my old home, and honestly, I prefer it to remain a mystery. Ever since Mr. Altman moved into the house next door about 6 months ago, I tried to be friendly, offering a helping hand and a hello whenever we crossed paths. However, he always kept to himself, with brief nods and seldom words. The most I managed were short conversations about the weather. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and helped out. That's why Mr. Altman's solitary presence became increasingly intriguing and, in a way, disturbing. Over time, I began to notice strange things. They were small details at first. Weird noises coming from his house during the night, sounds that seemed like something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor. I tried to convince myself that he might be renovating the house, despite never seeing any signs of construction or even tools and building materials nearby. But then, the neighborhood pets started disappearing. First, it was the Johnson's cat, then little Ellie's rabbit from the house on the corner. One night, curiosity overcame my caution. With my wife visiting her sister in the hospital, I was alone and couldn't sleep, obsessed with the noises and the disappearances. I decided I needed to find out what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly went out the back door. Mr. Altman's backyard was poorly lit, with just a weak light post near the garage casting long, sinister shadows. As I approached the garage, the smell hit me first. A sweet, putrid odor, like spoiled meat. My stomach churned with nausea, but I needed to know the truth. I reached the garage door, which was slightly ajar. What I saw inside nearly made me run back to my house. The light from my flashlight revealed a scene of horror. Several stacked boxes containing what appeared to be personal belongings. Photos of people I recognized from the local news as missing. On the floor, large dark stains, undoubtedly blood, formed a gruesome pattern. My mind spun trying to process the discovery. Was Mr. Altman involved in the disappearance of these people? Was he responsible for these terrible acts? I thought about calling the police immediately, but then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but it was just the shadow of a tree swaying in the wind. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. I hurried back home, locked all the doors and windows, and called the police. The officers arrived in minutes that seemed like hours. I explained everything while they searched Mr. Altman's garage. The truth came to light faster than I expected. He was indeed involved in criminal activities, including kidnappings and possibly worse. The following days were a blur of police activity and journalists roaming through the neighborhood. But what haunts me to this day is the thought that I lived next to a monster, and I narrowly escaped being one of his victims. Every time I hear a noise at night or see a shadow pass by the window, my heart races, and I wonder if I truly know the people around me. From the moment we moved into our new home, I felt a strange sensation of being watched. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, the streets were quiet, but something about the neighbors' glances made me uncomfortable. My wife thought I was just stressed about the move and the adjustments needed in a new house. One cold autumn night, while I was arranging some old boxes in the attic, I heard noises that seemed to come from our backyard. They sounded like careful, almost silent footsteps, if not for the slight crunching of dry leaves. I rushed out of the attic and looked out the bedroom window, trying to spot any figure in the darkness, but I saw nothing beyond the breeze swaying the tree branches. In the following days, every time I went out to work or to take the kids to school, I noticed figures standing in the windows, watching. It wasn't always the same house, nor always the same person, but the stares were constant. My wife convinced me to try and ignore it, suggesting that it might just be natural curiosity since we had moved in recently. The situation escalated on a stormy night when the electricity had gone out and only the lightning sporadically illuminated the environment. I was awakened by a loud noise coming from the front door. Descending the stairs with a flashlight, I saw through the frosted glass a shadow trying to manipulate the lock. The faint light from my device barely illuminated the figure, but it was enough for me to see that it was a man, one of my neighbors. The incoherent murmurs he emitted while trying to force the entry were disturbing. He was probably drugged or something. My breathing became heavy, my heart raced, and in a panic, I yelled at him to back off while firmly holding the doorknob from the inside. He stopped, stood still for a moment that seemed like an eternity, and then, under the light of a new lightning strike, I saw his eyes. Eyes that expressed no emotion, just a disturbing emptiness. He gave up on the door and disappeared into the night. The storm continued to roar outside, but the silence that followed inside the house was deafening. We decided that very night that we would install security cameras around the house. But after a few days, we preferred to move again since we called the police and had no return on anyone being arrested.